Great to see such a good turnout tonight. I tried to lure Joanne back. We're glad to see her back by saying I was going to speak about. She recently gave me several of Tony DeMello's books, the great Indian Jesuit who died in the mid '80s. And I told her I was going to base my teisho tonight on one of the books called The Song of the Bird. A number of his books are well, they're like koans, really, but they're brief stories that pack a message. They're not as hard as koans, but they're challenging and memorable very often. So I picked out a number that seem to have a theme to do with direct personal knowledge and experience rather than, book learning, and in particular, the possible dangers of relying too much on externals or on rituals or on written word. Now, it's been said very well by Richard Rohr and others that that and we shouldn't have to be told this, but historically we do. The main goal of any religion is experience of, well, they name it different things: God, the absolute, reality, yourself, true self, which all amount in the end pretty much to the same thing. But the danger always is, again, in any tradition, that you get sidetracked, you lose that transmission. Really, it is from person to person. That's the whole guru and etc. tradition, teacher in Buddhism, or master of novices, etc. In the Christian tradition, and you substitute for it, rules and creeds and books and dogmas. Not that any of that is bad, but as soon as it becomes an end in itself instead of just a tool, then it is bad. And you'll see that's the point of a number of the stories you'll hear. Now, the Buddhism is very, very strong on this whole notion of it's all about learning for yourself. The Buddha himself was very strong on that point. Don't take my word for it, see for yourself. And any teacher will tell you that, down through the ages. Don't take my word for it, don't idolize me, but experience for yourself. Thing is, in Christianity, it should be just as strong. Jesus himself quoted the prophet Isaiah. It goes all the way back there. They shall all be taught by God. Another way of saying, they'll all have your own experience. I'll write my law on their hearts, not just on tablets of stone, as it says in Jeremiah and elsewhere. And Jesus himself was clearly personal experience, personal contact with the healings that he did and the teachings he gave. If you see in St. Paul's writings, yes, for example, during these current days, we're reading the letter to the Colossians. It's all about experience of God, being dying and rising with Christ, having increased spiritual knowledge and experience of God through Christ. So too often, though, we have lost that wisdom current, wisdom tradition, handing on. And the danger is, if we don't recover it, as the theologian Karl Rahner said, we may not survive at all. But I would like to start with a couple of koans that illustrate this from the Mamon Kan. They're famous ones, and we've talked about them before. One is the 28th one. Ryutan blows out the candle. Now here, Tokusan was a great scholar of the Diamond Sutra and Buddhism in general, to call it that. Was talking all through the night with Ryutan, and so it was into the night. It was dark when he left the tent, and so Ryutan hands him a candle to find his way back. But just as he's taking the candle, Tokusan, from Ryutan blows out the candle. And it's in the pure dark. And finally, Tokusan is enlightened. Not by all the studies and the notes and the books and the diamond suits and all, but by the actual experience of here and now, the darkness. And the end of the koan is what he does the next day with these books, his notes, all this stuff that's written down that's external instead of internal. And I had someone from a Zendo that I teach out call me up about this passage just last week, asking about it. So Tokusan took his notes on the Diamond Sutra to the front of the temple, and with a flaming torch in his hand said, "Even though you've conquered the esoteric doctrines, it's like throwing a hair into vast space. Even though you've learned all the secrets of the world, it's like a drop of water into the vast ocean." And he set fire to all his notes. And he made a bow and took his leave. So it reminds me of the famous incident in the later life of Thomas Aquinas, who, after he had written these vast, marvelous volumes of the Summa Theologica, had an actual experience of what he was writing about. And he said, all these writings are just straw, and he couldn't write anymore. So these can be tools, but they have to point and lead to an experience, or basically worthless. Certainly nowhere near the actual value of the actual experience. And this is more straightforward, in a sense, more immediate. Number 39, Uman, Yunmen in Chinese, Uman in Japanese, said, "You missed it." So a monk said to Uman, "The radiance serenely illumines the whole universe." But before he could finish the line, because he was quoting a poem, Yunmen interrupted him and said, "Aren't those the words of Shosetsu?" And the monk said, yes, they are. And Uman said, "You missed it." So how did the monk miss it? Is the question. Well, because he's quoting somebody else. You can even quote scripture, but unless you actually know what you're talking about interiorly, it's vastly reduced in value. Mumon's verse, as part of the koan here, part of the text, is intriguing in this sense. A line is cast in the swift stream, and the greedy will be caught. If your mouth opens just a little bit, to swallow the hook, you will lose your life completely. So in the bad sense here, you're like a fish in the water. You should be swimming in the water, the whole of reality. You're immersed in reality. And meanwhile, you get hooked, and you lose your life by words that you're quoting. So that's interesting. So in that context, let's look at some of these stories in here. So the first one is, did you hear that bird sing? The Song of the Bird is the name of the book. And some of these, as you'll see, are actually Zen stories, are koans, but others are from other traditions. The disciple was always complaining to his master, "You're hiding the final secret of Zen from me." So he's on the wrong track already. And he would not accept the master's denying it. One day they were walking in the hills when they heard a bird sing. They actually heard it, which most people don't. Even if they say, "Oh, isn't that a pretty bird song?" They're still not hearing it. "Did you hear that bird sing?" said the master. "Yes," said the disciple. "Well, now you know that I've hidden nothing from you." "Yes." And he got it. Tony DeMello's commentary here is interesting. So if you've heard dozens of birds sing and seen hundreds of trees, was it the tree you saw or the label? Now, this is important. If you look at a tree and see a tree, you've not seen the tree. Right? And we categorize immediately, right? We see a tree and we say, "Oh, a tree." And you missed it. It's not a tree, it's So as soon as you say Baum or Arbel or tree, whatever language you're speaking, and you missed it. And we really have to cut that off or get the primitive actual experience of it. And then it's beyond words, of course, all experience is. And as soon as you put a label on it, then you're domesticating it and you're reducing cutting off its value. When you look at the tree and see a miracle, then you've seen the tree. That's what he says. Did your heart never fill with wordless wonder when you heard a bird in song? And then this famous Zen story, which I'll just quote briefly. When the Zen master attained enlightenment, he wrote the following lines to celebrate it. "Oh, wondrous marvel! I chop wood. I draw water from the well." Experience. So when you're able to say that in the morning, "I made the coffee. I'm driving to work. Wow!" Then you've got it. Stop complaining to yourself. Who's listening? Just do it. This is maybe my favorite story. It's a little longer, but it's worth looking at. The temple was built on an island, and it had 1,000 bells. Bells big and small. When the wind blew or the storm raged, all the bells would peal out in a symphony that would send the heart of the hearer into raptures. But over the centuries, the island sank into the sea, and with it the temple bells. Now, an ancient legend said that the bells continued to peal out ceaselessly and could be heard by anyone who would listen. So, inspired by this legend, a young man traveled thousands of miles determined to hear these bells. And he sat for days and listened with all his might. But all he could hear was the sound of the sea. He tried to block it out. So you know he's on the wrong track if you're blocking it out. He tried to block it out, but to no avail. The sound of the sea seemed to flood the world. So he kept at it for weeks. Finally, he decided to give up the attempt. Maybe it wasn't his destiny. Maybe it wasn't true. It was his final day, and he went to the shore to say goodbye to the sea and the sky and the wind and the coconut trees. He lay on the sand and for the first time listened to the sound of the sea. Soon he was so lost in the sound that he was barely conscious of himself, so deep was the silence that the sound produced. And in the depth of that silence, he heard it. The tinkle of a tiny bell, followed by another, and another, and another. And soon, every one of the 1,000 temple bells was pealing out in harmony, and his heart was wrapped in joyous ecstasy. So all these stories of temple bells and the inner palace and golden cities, it's you, it's just reality. The music of the spheres, it's all right there in your coffee in the morning. Do you wish to hear the temple bells? Listen to the sound of the sea. You wish to catch a glimpse of God? Look intently at creation. So can you hear that fabulous symphony that you are? Not if you're looking too hard for something that you think it's supposed to be, but what is actually there. Then a little thing here on the Word made flesh. You know, the Word was made flesh in the Gospel of John. Look at the darkness. It won't be long before you see the light. Gaze at things. Gaze. And it won't be long before you see the Word. The Word became flesh and dwells among us. Then I like Tony's last line here. And stop those frantic efforts to change flesh back into words. The Word became flesh. not the flesh becomes the word. Words, 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 is what he says. Don't get stuck with words, no matter how sacred they are, dogmas and creeds, etc. Here's that label thing again, the label makers. Life is like heady wine. Everyone reads the label on the bottle. Hardly anyone tastes the wine. Oh, what is this? How do you define this? How does this fit into the scheme of my religion or my country or whatever? And then he quotes the famous koan. Buddha once held up a flower to his disciples and asked them to say something about it. One pronounced a lecture, another a poem, another a parable. They tried to outdo each other in depth and erudition. They were label makers. But Mahakasyapa smiled and said nothing. Only he had seen the flower. My energy is spent deciphering labels. These are very telling. The mystic was back from the desert. Tell us, they said, what God is like. But how could he ever tell them what he had experienced in his heart? Can God be put into words? He finally gave them a formula, so inaccurate, so inadequate, in the hope that some of them might be tempted to experience it for themselves. They seized upon the formula. They made it a sacred text. They imposed it on others as a holy belief. They went to great pains to spread it in foreign lands. Some even gave their lives for it. The mystic was sad. It might have been better if he'd said nothing. He's, arguing about the finger pointing to the, it's the same idea, the finger pointing to the moon. We're arguing about whose finger is better. Meanwhile, the moon. And the more perspectives you can get, the better, huh? On the moon. Just one or two more here. The explorer. The explorer returned to his people who were eager to know about the Amazon. Not Amazon, the Amazon, right? But how could he ever put into words the feelings that flooded his heart when he saw exotic flowers and heard the night sounds of the forest and the temple bells? When he sensed the danger of wild beasts or paddled over treacherous rapids, he said, "Go find out for yourselves." To guide them, he drew a map of the river. They pounced upon the map. They framed it in their town hall. They made copies of it for themselves. And all who had a copy considered themselves experts on the river. For did they not know its every turn and bend and how broad it was and how deep and where the rapids were and where the falls were? The Buddha refused to be drawn into talking about God, Tony says. He was probably familiar with the dangers of drawing maps for armchair explorers. And too many religious people and religious leaders are armchair explorers, it would seem. At least that's the danger. Then there's a story about Thomas Aquinas that I just told you. I won't repeat it. And one more here. The devil and his friend. The devil once went for a walk with a friend. I don't recommend it, but They saw a man ahead of them stoop down and pick up something from the ground. "What did that man find?" asked the friend. The devil said, "A piece of truth." "Doesn't that disturb you?" asked the friend. "No," said the devil. "I'll let him make a belief out of it." And then the commentary by Tony. A religious belief is a signpost pointing the way to the truth. When you cling to the signpost, You're prevented from moving toward the truth because you think you have it already. So if you say Jesus Christ is true God and true man, and you say, wow, well, what's your experience? Those are signposts. I used that in a homily, a daily homily recently. They said, here you have all these people clinging to the signposts. It's saying, New York that way. They say, oh, wow, the signpost, wow, New York. Meanwhile, they never go. It's all open to be experienced by yourself. Vast, magnificent, wondrous things. Use the signposts in all the traditions. But don't hold on to them. Go for it. And maybe that's why people don't, because it costs nothing less than everything, as T.S. Eliot said. Because you got to let go of all the lesser stuff, especially yourself, in order to find your true self and to hear the ringing of those bells.